Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bollen. Today we have a new guest. We have Ken Peterson, who is the author of the book Mormon Doctrine and the Apocrypha, a concordance of teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Extracanonical writings. And as you may know from my blog and other works, I'm a scripture nerd, not just canonical, but extra-canonical as well. So it's good to actually meet another person who, when it comes to like apocryphal and pseudepigraphical texts, actually enjoys discussing and writing about them. So Ken, thank you for coming on today.
Oh, what a pleasure. And I'm excited to visit with you as well, knowing your background and your expertise and the things that you've authored. I can't wait to hear your perspective on all of this.
I appreciate it. Before we could discuss like your book and its genesis and some of its contents, how about you give a brief overview of your good self? Like who you are, what's your education, what do you do? Have you always been LDS? And also what got you interested in religious studies in general? And that maybe we can take it from there.
Excellent. I grew up in a small LDS community in Wyoming, a place called Cowley, in a very strong, loving, kind LDS family. And the thing I loved about the way my parents raised us, as devout as they were, it was never coerced upon us. I remember distinctly my dad saying something like, "Son, you know what I believe, but you have to figure this out for yourself," which I proceeded to do. So it was very healthy in that regard. One thing I didn't realize about myself until I was an adult, and I don't know why I'm this way, and most people don't, being a faithful Latter-day Saint, people don't know this about me, but I am a natural born skeptic. I'm deeply skeptical of everyone and everything, especially when it comes to matters of religion. And so the truth claims of the LDS Church did not, I never just willingly and blindly accepted them. I wasn't bitter or mean about it. I just, I had a sense from a very early age that not everybody told the truth all the time. You know, I knew that. And so I have been highly skeptical. So my deep dives into religious studies, particularly in regard to the truth claims of Joseph Smith, and in terms of all religion in general, including Christianity, had to do with the fact that I wasn't going to believe anything that I did not have solid evidence to believe. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where my methodology and my psychology regarding my belief system, where that's coming from. And then, of course, being raised a Latter-day Saint, we're familiar with this teaching, the whole concept that in the Book of Mormon, we're explicitly taught that the canon is not closed. The heavens are not closed. Like your wonderful book, Sola Scriptura, that there are other sacred texts in the world, and as Latter-day Saints, we anticipate that they will come forth. And so I had that in my mind growing up. And anyway, encyclopedia. And Hugh Nibley, well, I need to back up just a little bit. I first became familiar with the existence of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think it was 1978. And Theodore Gaster's publication was, you could buy them in English. They were not complete, but they had been out, and Einar Eriksson had produced these Dead Sea Scroll tapes on cassette for those of us who are older. And that blew my mind. In my view, the concept of the Dead Sea Scrolls was fulfilling, in some measure, what was prophesied in Second Nephi, that other scriptures would come forth. Then I served my mission in Japan, Fukuoka, and one of my favorite missionary companions, Joseph Swick III, introduced me to Hugh Nibley, and it changed my life. And I will always be indebted to Joe for that.
Just before you continue, I'm guessing that's the same Joe Strick III who helped with the book Meta Infinite. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. He and I, we had a wonderful, wonderful mission together, and studying the scriptures together was always thrilling and enlightening. And anyway, that's one of those watershed events in your life that it changed your life forever. To introduce me to the world of, for lack of a better word, Mormon intellectualism, particularly the mind of Hugh Nibley. Because when I read Hugh Nibley, I read things that I was curious about. I read things that I was interested in, and it helped me realize that as being a Latter-day Saint like me was not a bad thing, and that it was actually could be a good thing, um, depending on how you used that. So reading Hugh Nibley, I would read comments like this that I have on the screen, where he talks about entire libraries being discovered, which blew my mind because I knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but then I'm thinking, what other libraries is he talking about? And then this comment of his, which is so typical Nibley, really struck me, where he says, an awesome outpouring of newly discovered documents of direct bearing on the history and teachings of the church is even now in full spate. Amazing and confounding Jewish and Christian scholars are bursting with good news for the Latter-day Saints who ignore them completely. That tickled me. So that just spurred me on to find out what he was talking about. And of course, these things that he was talking about were in the 1980s and earlier. So this was, decades ago. So my first mission was to discover what in the world, what are these records that he and others are talking about? And we're talking about, in general, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, which can mean a variety of things. In terms of the title of my book, I'm not talking about the biblical Apocrypha, the intertestamental Apocrypha. I'm talking about Apocrypha in the general sense, anything outside the established canon. I want to talk a little bit about Pseudepigrapha. Many people in the Christian world use Pseudepigrapha as an excuse to throw a sacred text out. Pseudepigrapha does not mean it's false. All it means it's of an ancient origin, but the manuscripts do not, the extant manuscripts that we have of a pseudepigraphic text do not match the attributed author's time period. For example, the Pearl of Great Price. We know those don't date. Even the Joseph Smith papyri do not date to the time period of Abraham. It's pseudepigraphic in that sense. But it does not necessarily mean that a pseudepigraphic text is not authentic in some sense. In a large sense, all scripture that we have today, all sacred texts are pseudepigraphic because we don't have the text, the original text for any of them. Anyway, I don't know how you feel about that, but that's kind of my thoughts on that. And this is too small, I think, for everybody to read, but I want to just give an idea of how many of these texts we're talking about. I did count a total of the number of texts that I explored for possible inclusion into my book, and I read through over 354 ancient texts. And I wanted to be very careful that the texts I included were respectable texts. I wanted to be sure that they were ancient, but no later than the 1st century of the Common Era. They had to be early. They had to have evidence of authenticity. So we didn't have any just made up texts, and I'm not going to mention any because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But so we have hundreds of these texts, hundreds and hundreds. And the trick was how to find them all. And I started searching before the internet was a thing. And the only way to do that was to explore the bibliographies of Hugh Nibley's works. So that's where I started. And I began to collect my own extra-canonical library. And then, of course, when the internet became a thing, all bets were off. You could access any of these texts listed here, full text online. And so my extra-canonical library exploded. So on this page, we're looking at pseudepigraphical texts. This is a fairly comprehensive listing with the 3 books of Enoch, etc. Then we have the listing of the Dead Sea Scrolls. and what we'd call New Testament Apocrypha, early Christian texts. Then we have the Nag Hammadi and the Gnostic libraries. And so the first question Ken Peterson had was, how much of this stuff is out there? How can I get a hold of it? And ultimately, there came a time when I had everything that I knew in existence in my own library. And then the next question was, what does all of this stuff have to do with me as a Latter-day Saint? And are the corollaries that Hugh Nibley, Einar Erickson, and others talked about, do these corollaries really exist? Because here's the skeptical mind working. I'd read Hugh Nibley and say, well, that's nice, but that's hard to believe until I can see it with my own eyes, which is why I collected this stuff. And I wanted to see for myself with my own eyes if those corollaries existed. So that was the second issue. The third problem that I soon discovered was that the corpus of literature was so vast. I mean, it dwarfs the canon itself, the closed canon. It dwarfs that. How on earth am I supposed to keep track of all of that? I mean, nobody can remember all of that, right? In my first attempts, I would find something interesting in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, ooh, that would cross-reference nicely with such and such in the New Testament. And so I would go to pencil in the cross-reference, and after about a week of this, it became painfully obvious that would never work. There just isn't enough room. There's far too much. And the other issue was friends and acquaintances would ask me, I'd tell them what I was reading, and they'd say, well, that's interesting. What does it say? And I was tongue-tied because there was too much. I could not think of a way to communicate to anyone in less than 2 hours the contents of these things. So I wrestled with this. I have all of this stuff. I'm interested in it. I'm finding lots of things. What am I supposed to do with this? How am I supposed to digest this in any useful fashion for anybody else to learn from if they have this similar interest? And then one of those eureka moments, the idea came to me. I was trying to cross-reference with the existing topical concordance we have in our LDS edition of the Bible, which I love. And it occurred to me, that's exactly what you need. You need a concordance, a topical concordance for these extra-canonical writings. So I began to look online to see if there was such a thing. I didn't find any. I don't know if you found any. And the old saying is, you want to write the book that you want to read. That's exactly what I ended up doing. So I began to compile. So the problem was, I finally had kind of an idea of how much is out there. So I could put my arms around it. I began reading through all of it. And I began leaving a trail of breadcrumbs of corollaries that I found with our beliefs. And ultimately began compiling the database, the alphabetical database of correlating teachings. And of course, because of COVID, I finally found myself, for the first time in my life, with extended periods of time, which would allow me to do that. So that's how it all came about. Truman Madsen talked about all of these things, LDS terminologies that were a part of these ancient texts. So the issue became, I have all of this stuff, I'm finding all of these corollaries, but because of the vast quantities of material, I could not see the forest for the trees. So until I could actually compile it in an organized fashion, an alphabetical topical concordance, it was hard to make sense of it. And I have to tell you, this whole project has occupied my whole adult life. And it's a lot of work and it's a lot of reading, but it was the most exciting thing I've done ever, in addition to career and things like that. To be able to see, and it wasn't until I was finished compiling that I saw the big picture. The big picture was ultimately 179 distinct LDS teachings showing up on the average 2,000-year-old documents, attested thousands of times. It was far more than I thought. It was more than Hugh Nibley, Einar Erickson, and Truman Madsen and others led on. Because back then, I don't know that they had the means to do such a comprehensive survey that we have in the digital age. Anyway, so that's kind of how that book came about, and kind of my belief system and how I think. Do you have any questions after that?
Let's just put this on again. Oh no, I think that's a very good overview. Is like how you wrote the book. So, and also like I have a copy in print back in Ireland, but I do have also the Kindle version. And as you said, like there's 179 topics just under Adam related material, which is something I've been working on professionally for like the last year plus.
Oh yeah.
You know, Adam and Eve were asexual before the fall. Adam and Eve's glory before the fall. Adam buried at Golgotha. Adam cannot change before the fall. Adam presides, and Adamic language. And for those who are in the know about Joseph Smith's theology of Adam, and the very high view of Adam / Michael, who we also believe to be the Ancient of Days from Daniel 7, which I found a lot of material on, by the way, which hopefully will be published soon. That's kind of a good stuff. So, so maybe like a few questions based on the book. Of the 179 topics you discuss, is there any one or two that you think is your favorite, but also you think like has the most convergences with antiquity?
Let me share a couple of favorites. So that's the front and back cover of the book, listing what it's about. This is a description of the text. Out of the roughly 354 ancient texts, by the way, this is super exciting. 1 month after I published my book, was it 2 or 3 years ago, an entire new volume of New Testament Apocrypha was published. So I'm going through that and finding corollaries already. And now, next month, I think about May 23rd, another volume of New Testament Apocrypha is coming out. I'll show photos of that later. But so the corpus continues to grow because of the wonderful age in which we live. So let's see. Out of the 354 extra-canonical sacred texts that I considered for inclusion, 66 of them had very, very strong parallels. And those are the ones that I included in the book. The other thing that I loved about the idea of a topical concordance is it completely avoided Ken Peterson having to give personal opinion on any of this, because you suddenly find yourself in hot water. You can doing that. In just writing a straight up concordance, topical concordance, you let the texts speak for themselves. I did not want the text to be a polemic device. I wanted it to be respectable in academic circles to the extent that one person could do that. So I didn't want it to have any opinions. I just, you see the LDS teaching, and I would cite the most authoritative LDS source that I could that was succinct. And then I would simply cite the extra canonical references in alphabetical order and let people make of it what they will, as is the point of any great concordance. I mean, they have multiple uses. I can't get enough of them. So 66 of the texts were of the ancient extra canonical texts that were included as part of my book. And because of the digital age, well, one of my favorite sections of the book is on page 359, where I list the annotated bibliography. I list each of the 66 ancient texts that I cite in the book, and very brief descriptions of what they're supposed to be about, where they're found, when they were translated. So we have some idea where they're coming from and where people can acquire them if they like. And then a source, an extra canonical source index. So if you want to see how many times I reference the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see that. And then a general index based on the search operators from the topical guide, plus a few others I added in. So of the listed here are the 66 ancient texts that I cite in Mormon Doctrine in the Apocrypha. And if you had to ask me which my favorites were, I do have a couple there. I want to know what your favorites are. Do you have favorite extra-canonical texts? I mean, that's hard to say.
Yeah,
There's
it's
so
kind of
many.
difficult to say what are my favorites. Like amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably my favorite text is the Melchizedek Scroll
Oh, well,
11Q13.
yes.
And for those who do not know about that, it's basically a reworking of Psalm 82, where it's the heavenly Melchizedek figure who's the presiding god, if you will, over the council. And the council are actually they're a type of lord deities. They're basically demons. They're the sons of Belial. Um, and what's rather interesting is like this has loads of parallels with Hebrews with the Melchizedek figure and Melchizedek typology, but also Melchizedek. He suffers, and his suffering actually expiates the sins of God's people. So there's an idea of like this heavenly messianic figure whose sufferings atones for the, in some way, if not propitiates, at least expiates the sins of God's people. You know, a very Christianized document, and there's a lot of
Very,
other
very
cool stuff
interesting.
as well. Yeah, but
Very interesting.
in terms of say the uppercase A Apocrypha, probably oh, I love Sirach. There's a lot of cool stuff in Sirach. Lowercase A Apocrypha because it's a multivalent term, or pseudepigrapha. There's loads like the ones dealing with the Testament and Apocalypse of Abraham, whatever we can reconstruct of those. But there's loads of
Yes,
other real
yes.
cool stuff as well. Um, you
I have to
as you
say,
as people can see here, there's loads, not just of Gnostic or pseudepigraphical literature, but like even like the volume 3 of the New Testament Apocrypha book, which I think you're alluding to. They keep rediscovering new themes, and they can reconstruct from say patristic quotations and Jewish quotations at least a rudimentary reworking of some fragments. It's like the pseudepigraphical text that Jude cites in Jude 9 and Origen and Clement of Alexandria harkens to as well. There's like some attempt to re reconstruct that text, so there's a lot of real cool stuff that's even being discovered now. Even like
very
early Christian
exciting.
literature, like Origen's works, we keep rediscovering and translating new material as well. So
Oh,
there's a
that's
lot of cool
exciting.
stuff.
That's exciting. I have to say, I all three books of Enoch I really enjoy. Um, Dead Sea Scrolls, of course. The books of Yehu, the Gnostic literature, Pissa Sophia and the books of Yehu really, really get me excited. I love that stuff. And then I have to mention um, Joseph and Asenet. It's, it is such, it's just a beautiful story.
And also, there's an allusion to eternal marriage in the text as well. So
That's in my book. You'll see that in
yeah,
my
I know.
book a lot. Yeah. And the life of Adam and Eve. I mean, it's hard to say, but very, very exciting things.
Yeah, when it comes to the life, before you move on, just when it comes to the life of Adam and Eve, and also you mentioned the Sibylline oracles, Adam is actually given the same type of cultic worship as God is. In fact, God actually commands the angels to give Adam, because he's the image of God.
Yeah.
In the Greek of the Sibylline oracles age, latria or latruo, which is the highest form of religious worship and veneration, and Satan,
Is very upset about that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's why he falls.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of cool stuff as well. Kind of reflects a very high view of Adam. And if you're cognizant about the Adam Christology of the New Testament, that's really informative to see what's going on in Philippians and 1 Corinthians and Romans as well. So a lot of cool stuff there as well. But yeah.
The other one that jumped out at me was the very recent revelation of the Magi. Oh my goodness. I just, that is so full of that is so full of LDS teachings that Brent Landau himself he's aware of that. I communicated with him when that first came out to thank him for his work on bringing forth this marvelous document, and he says, "Yeah, there's a lot of parallels with what you guys believe." Yeah. So anyway, some favorite teachings. I mean, like Bullseye's really stark teachings. This concept of 8,000 year history, which is interesting to me because we're familiar with the 7,000 years as mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. But the 8,000 years, in my mind, helps account for Christ being born in the meridian of time. And Section 88 and Joseph Fielding Smith talk about this little bit period of time after the millennium where things are worked out, in a word. And here we find in the letter of Barnabas the exact same reference to 8,000 years. I mean, who else believes that? I find that extraordinary. And then a little bit about the letter of Barnabas. We don't need to go into that now. Abraham learning astronomy from God is mentioned specifically in the Apocalypse of Abraham. Now, what we should mention here that people may or may not be aware of, Joseph Smith, of these 66 ancient texts that I'm citing, Joseph Smith had access to exactly none of them. There are some who postulate that he had access to First Enoch because it had been translated in England in 1821, but it sat in manuscript form for a decade. I mean, he had zero access to it. They were aware of it. Go ahead.
And just on that, just two things. When it comes to, like, say, Abrahamic traditions, I'll let you continue on this. I'm sure you're familiar with the 2001 book, but just to plug it, Traditions about the Early Life of Abraham, edited by Tretness et al. You shout out the Book of Mormon Central. They actually scanned it and put it on their website. But also when it comes to, say, the availability of one Enoch to Joseph Smith, Michael Quinn, and most recently Colby Townsend have been trying to claim that. Yes. Jeffrey Bradshaw, who's not only, he's actually a friend of mine, but he's also a co-worker of mine as well.
Right.
He's done a good work on Enochian traditions, as well as Joseph Smith's access to it. So just make a shout out to Jeff. He's discussed this a bit in his books and articles.
Oh boy, he is prolific. I love his stuff. And a little bit about the Apocalypse of Abraham. Adam and Eve, as you mentioned, were asexual before the fall. That is certainly unique to Latter-day Saint teachings. Here we have it mentioned specifically in 3 separate ancient texts. The last one, the investiture of Abaddon. During the 200 years that Adam was with his wife Eve in the paradise of delight, they were virgins, being like angels of God. And it's very specific. And it's funny, Latter-day Saints would read such things. We're not surprised. Non-LDS Christians and Jews alike of the Judeo-Christian tradition would look at this and find it confusing because it's such a different teaching. A little bit about each of those texts. This one, the one idea in my book that required a little bit of a connection from me personally was this concept. And this concept is mentioned numerous times in these ancient texts, that Adam's body, mummified body, was buried at Golgotha. A very interesting teaching that no one really teaches today or talks about today in my experience. And Joseph Smith, my brain made the connection in the Joseph Smith translation of Matthew 27:33. He says the Golgotha is not the place of the skull, it is a place of burial, which was curious to say the least, because nobody believes anything or anyone was buried at Golgotha. That's where he was crucified. And then I find all of these 12 different ancient texts saying that, in fact, Adam's body is buried at Golgotha. And the beautiful thing about that, in terms of doctrine, is why he was buried there. It's some of the most beautiful symbolism I've come across. As in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive, the New Testament teaches. And here is Adam's body placed precisely under the point of the crucifixion so that the blood of Christ would fall upon his mummified body, closing the circle, redeeming all mankind through that beautiful symbolism.
Just on that, on the whole Adam being buried at Golgotha, what's rather interesting is, and hopefully this will be published by B.H. Roberts Foundation soon, but a group of early Latter-day Saints, including Eliza Orr Snow, went to the Holy Land, and they once came across someone who actually claimed, I'll actually just read it. This is actually George A. Smith, his letter to Robert Campbell, February 26, 1873. Our guide, Isaac, told us gravely that there was a rock cleft at the crucifixion from which was taken the skull of Adam, and took us into an adjoining room called the Greek Church, and there showed us a small pedestal, which he said was the center of the world, and there was buried the skull of our father Adam. So there was like some early Latter-day Saints did come across this tradition in the 19th century. Now, because they held to some form of Adam God theology, I think they kind of said, this is weird. But I think like a lot more early modern LDS would be a bit more amenable to this. So
that's unbelievable. That is unbelievable. That's crazy. But that was Eliza R. Snow.
Oh no, it wasn't. I think Eliza was part of the party, but no, it was George A. Smith. He's the editor of Robert Campbell, February 26,
Amazing.
1873.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so
Why would they even think of such a thing? That's
yeah,
crazy.
it was initially published in Correspondence of Palestine Tourists. And it featured letters by Smith, Snow, Shetler, and Eliza Orr Snow. It was part of their
Wow.
tour of the Holy Land. So yeah, I just thought I mentioned that. That came to mind.
Wow. That's awesome. That's amazing. Accountability for animals. Animals in the kingdom of God. The Doctrine and Covenants and Joseph Smith were very clear that all of creation will be resurrected, that the animals are a part of the resurrection, and animals that in the words of Joseph Smith, I'll try to remember the quote exactly, there are tens of thousands of creatures that we can only imagine, and all will be resurrected. And here we have in Second Enoch that notion being clearly taught. Just as every human soul is according to numbers, so it is also with the animal souls. They're all going to be resurrected. Christ's bilocation. I was reading the revelation of the Magi, and it's a rather small account. A person can read it in a night, but it is so full of information and LDS references to LDS teachings. I could have included his whole text. But what happened was these Magi who were waiting for the promised sign of the advent of the Christ, of Messiah, were purifying themselves, and the sign appeared. The prophesied sign was, quote unquote, a star, which the text describes, and this is Brent Landau, who's not LDS, translating the Syriac to English. He translated a pillar of light descended upon them. I would have to say one of the most interesting sections of my book is the section on pillar of light. These ancient documents go on and on and on about what Peterson calls the light stream, the pillar of light, or all these pillar of fire. One of my most interesting references, the Doctrine and Covenants, is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which discusses the grand central station in heaven of these pillars of light, where angels are coming and going constantly through these pillars of light, conducting their business. That's a very fascinating section that expands upon our understanding of what this pillar of light is, what it's for, and how God utilizes it. Anyway, back to Christ's bilocation. So the pillar of light appears to these Magi, and according to the revelation of the Magi, there are 12 of them, surprise, surprise. And in the pillar of light is Jesus Christ himself, announcing to these 12 Magi his forthcoming birth. All the while, his body resides within Mary's womb. How can he be two places at once? That seems crazy until you realize that's exactly the same thing that happened in the Book of Mormon. While Christ's body was yet in Mary's womb in Bethlehem, he appears to Nephi, son of Nephi, to announce his forthcoming birth. Exactly the same thing, which I find it an interesting and an insightful parallel. Christ was able to do that, not only for Nephi in the Book of Mormon, but for the Magi in what they call the land of Shinar, somewhere in the east. I love this reference. Creation. Latter-day Saints believe that there was a dual creation. Everything was created spiritually, then temporally, right? And Joseph Smith taught that all spirit is matter. Boy, these documents talk a lot about conservation of matter that Joseph Smith clearly taught. So in Second Enoch, listen, children, before anything ever existed, and before ever any created thing was created, the Lord created the whole of this creation, visible and invisible. That's what that says to me. And so on and so forth. I found that an incredible bullseye. This is interesting. Brigham Young taught that when Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden and fell from their terrestrial, fell from paradise, that the earth itself fell into space, he says, and took up its abode in this planetary system. That's crazy stuff. But in let's see, let's go to the second quote here. Inasmuch, this is from the book of Adam and Eve, while he, Adam, was in the garden and heard the voice of God and the sound he made in the garden and feared him, Adam never saw the brilliant light of the sun, neither did the flaming heat thereof touch his body. Does that mean that he wasn't near the sun at that time? It's possible. The first one is a little better, this last two paragraphs. And when he, Adam, was in the heavens, in the realms of light, he knew not of darkness, but he transgressed. And I, God, made him fall from heaven upon the earth, and it was this darkness that came upon him. This is one of those bullseyes. Latter-day Saints taught that Enoch lives for 365 years. That's a very specific number. And lo and behold, Second Enoch, a book of Adam and Eve, say exactly the same thing. It's a nice coincidence, don't you think? Eternal marriage is taught clearly in the Gospel of Philip, and Joseph and Asenath. Of Joseph and Asenath, by the way, I think has profound implications for us today. And this was hinted at by Hugh Nibley. I think it was in The Trouble with Ham. I love that essay. He was so far ahead of his time. Here, Asenath was a daughter of the priest caste, most likely black. And her marriage to Joseph is not only known by God, it is he washes her, anoints her, gives her the garment, and then seals. And then she and Joseph become sealed. And she's given a new name, City of Refuge. Why was her new name called the City of Refuge? Because in her posterity, all the nations, all the non-Israelite nations of the world would be brought into the family of Abraham, the family of God. The adoption that Latter-day Saints talk about, were adopted into Ephraim. And Ephraim was the son of Asenath. She was the city of refuge. And the symbolism is that God does not want his children to be divided in any way. And that the union between Joseph and Asenath, union between races and cultures, is what he desires. Express clearly enough how much I love that document, which is actually quite ancient. It predates the Christian era. So, Joseph Smith, we know, introduced us to the concept of the plurality of eternities. That eternity just doesn't mean forever. It can also mean a very lengthy epoch, a creative period in time. So from eternity to eternity, I am the same, or eternities in plural. When I cite evidences of that in LDS teachings, we find the very same usage of that idea in text in First Enoch, Songs of David, and the untitled text. We who have erred from eternity to eternity until this very day, so on and so forth. Premortality, that Latter-day Saints uniquely believe that we lived in our premortal existence before entering into mortality, that we have no memory of that. And we find many, many references of a premortal existence in these ancient texts. And as the Pistis Sophia talks about it, before we enter mortality, we have to drink out of a cup of forgetfulness, which is very interesting to me. I could talk for a long time about the Pistis Sophia and how taken I am with that work It
Yeah, in
took me,
fact, not to cut you off, but like when it comes to the Pistis
no,
Sophia,
no.
that's actually been a text that's been discussed, not just like for Latter-day Saint doctrine, but even the Book of Mormon. Late John Tretton, as well as Matthew Roper, discussed that when it comes to some parallels between that and the Book of Mormon, like the 3 Days of Darkness and some other issues. So it's actually a pretty popular text in some, albeit nerdy LDS quarters as well.
The thing about the Pistis Sophia is that the terminology is so different from ours that it's hard to recognize the teachings as being the same. But once you begin to figure out the doctrines are the same, they're just calling it by different words that we're not used to hearing in our culture. About the third time through the Pistis Sophia, it all started to dawn on me. Temple rites and doing all those temple rites vicariously, veils, signs, tokens, names. It's amazing. And then where the text came from is really quite amazing. It's undeniably authentic because it's a Coptic on ancient papyrus dating to the first few centuries of the Common Era, but it showed up at some London bookseller's market and was bought by Dr. Askew. Who knows? Who knows where it came from, right? One of the questions I have. So in Moses, we talk that God has created worlds without number. Innumerable are they unto man, but they're all numbered unto me, for they're mine and I know them. In 3rd Enoch, we read, he perceives 18,000 worlds at a glance. He discerns them. He sees into all of them, and he knows all that is in them. That's almost guards in heaven. Famous citation that the endowment teaches us, among other things, the role of angels who stand as sentinels that will enable us to walk back to the presence of the Father, passing the angels who stand as sentinels. There are 9 such references that I discovered in these ancient texts. Sentinels and guards whose job it is to guard the way of the veil to the treasury of light in the various kingdoms. And in Pistis Sophia, there are 7 such kingdoms that are listed. Here's the more distinct the LDS teaching is, the more remarkable it is to find it for me in these ancient texts. That Joseph Smith taught that the intelligence of man is co-equal in age with God himself. We are uncreated, our intelligence, the essence of who we are. From the Nag Hammadi library, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, we read that very thing. And afterward was revealed a whole multitude of confronting self-begotten ones, equal in age and power, being in glory and without number, whose race is called the generation over whom there is no kingdom. Let's see. From the one in whom you yourselves have appeared from these men, and that whole multitude over which there is no kingdom is God, whose likeness is with you. Pretty exciting stuff.
Just on the whole intelligence. Oh, I'm sorry. Just on the intelligences thing. I'm not disputing the parallel, but like I'm sure like some will claim, well, Joseph got this from like Thomas Dick. Fawn Brody kind of made that a famous argument and sometimes repeated. So I just thought like for those who are listening, there's actually a master's dissertation by Edward T. Jones from 1969 BYU. It's available online. Theology of Thomas Dick and its possible relationship to that of Joseph Smith. Kind of goes through like say not just the intelligences thing, but some other aspects of Joseph's theology that the Tanners, Fawn Brody, and some others have claimed Joseph simply cribbed from the writings of Thomas Dick. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
You know, and the thing I like about that is I perfectly understand why they do that. I mean, and this is for skeptics like me and them. That leap of faith is a difficult thing because there are extraordinary, fanciful claims, unless there's, for people like me, indisputable evidence to tie my skeptical mind to. So I actually sympathize with people who are trying to figure out where Joseph Smith came up with 179 kooky teachings and then some. Right? And especially when you start finding corollaries with ancient texts. the rational mind is trying to figure out how that was done by conventional means. Because if you can't figure that out, then you're left with his truth claim, right? Anyway, we believe that Jesus Christ atoned for all the worlds he created, right? Worlds without number, as is stated in Moses. The revelation of the Magi says exactly the same thing. Skipping to the end of this lengthy quote, this is the bread of life that comes down from me for believers. He is the sower of the word of life. He is the shepherd of truth, who gives himself as ransom for his flock. He is the great priest who by his blood absolves the worlds, in plural. Pillar of light. This is the citation I mentioned before, the Grand Central Station of the Pillar of Light, where the angels are coming and going to and from heaven. It's amazing to me. By the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls presented an issue for me in terms of how to cite them. As you are well aware, every different publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls lists them a little bit differently. I had one critic on my Amazon page for the book ask me why I didn't list everything by chapter and verse. Why did I use page numbers? Because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can't, chapter verse isn't going to work. So I had to settle upon a specific edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I preferred the Michael Wise translation. I just like how the English flowed over the Vermes and others. But so that's why I use page numbers. So I wanted to be consistent throughout the book, but it's the Dead Sea Scrolls' fault that I didn't use chapter and verse. Mother in Heaven, fairly unique to LDS teachings. We find that throughout. And by the way, very important references that give us glimpses as to her role, even beyond what the Latter-day Saints understand. Notice here, I discovered 19 such references in these ancient texts to female deity, to the Mother in Heaven. And here, Latter-day Saints believe that the ordinances required of us in mortality, in preparation for eternity, must be performed in time, in mortality. And we find that exact same teaching in the Gospel of Philip and over again in the Pistis Sophia, that these ordinances have to be performed in this life. And then the Pistis Sophia goes on, he says, if there's a righteous person who did not have these ordinances performed, you can perform it for them. That's a neat thought. Procreation in the eternities. We believe that we will beget the souls of men in eternity. Gospel of Philip says the same thing. Only it says, I like this, for it is by a kiss that the perfect conceive and give birth. Sounds pretty easy. Oh. One of the, by the way, if time is an issue, you let me know, but I have a few to go here. I prepared today. Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, gives us a very interesting teaching that the means for quickening the dead, bringing them forth from their graves, is the pillar of light. The pillar of light does that. Revelation of the Magi, the same exact thing. I saw a pillar of light diving down inside the bowels of the earth, and the dead rise to meet it, and they worship and glorify it with great joy. I really enjoyed that one, obviously. The righteous dead are awaiting Christ's advent in the spirit world. We find that 13 times, which is pretty cool. This one doctrinally was not so amazing to me as the similarity of the text and what I hope people understand is how hard this is. This is like pulling a rabbit out of the hat 2,000 years later, where the Doctrine and Covenants is given directly to Joseph Smith in English, and the Pistis Sophia is translated from 2,000-year-old Coptic into English by G.R.S. Mead, not LDS, and they read almost identically. The concept in Doctrine and Covenants. If you labor all your days crying repentance and save it be one soul unto me, how great shall be your joy in the kingdom of the Father. And now if your joy will be great with one soul that you have brought unto me, kingdom of the Father, how great will be joy if you should bring many souls unto me. Pissa Sophia. I, Jesus Christ, say unto you, he who shall keep in life and save only one soul, besides the dignity which he possesseth in the light kingdom, he will receive yet another dignity for the soul which he saved, so that he who shall save many souls, besides the dignity which he possesseth in the light, he will receive many other dignities for the souls which he hath saved. It's almost identical in phraseology, in context, and in order. That's amazing. And in vocabulary. How does that happen? I mean, if I couldn't believe that Joseph Smith was receiving revelation, I would be the first one out there figuring out how Joseph Smith had access to Pista Sophia, page 222. You know, it's so similar.
It appeared in the missing Spalding manuscript.
Wow, I'm going to have to see that one. Spirit is matter. Oh, such a profound concept taught by a man in the 1830s, Joseph Smith. All spirit is matter. There's no such thing as immaterial matter. How far ahead of his time was he in all aspects? Gospel of Philip teaches us the same thing. You say the spirit in the flesh, but it is also this light in the flesh. This too is a matter which is in the flesh. The other thing that kills me about that, these Gnostic texts, this is Gospel of Philip from the Nag Hammadi Library. We're talking about, again, a 2,000-year-old, almost 2,000-year-old text, where they were thinking about these things, which we think only in the age of enlightenment, we're the only ones who consider such things. It's amazing to me.
And what's rather interesting about that is, like, you'd expect a Gnostic document to be as opposed to materiality as possible. So
Yeah.
so this is actually antithetical to their cosmology and their theology. So it's kind of significant. It still appears in the text, although intrinsically it's actually anti-Gnostic.
You know what, though? I'm glad you brought that up, because I believe how Gnosticism is described and characterized today, and this is just my opinion, having read the Gnostic texts, how it's characterized today has nothing to do with what I read in the texts. What I read in the text does not look like Gnosticism as it's described today. That's very strange to me. Because Pista Sophia goes on and on and on about matter, the significance of matter, the importance, the eternal importance of matter. That there are wars in eternity over matter because it's so important to this plan of salvation. Anyway, Joseph Smith changed the order of wheat and tares in Matthew chapter 13. Let's see. First, the wheat is gathered, and then the tares are bound in bundles, and then they're burned, right? He changed that from the Matthew 13, it was reversed. In Matthew 13, he said, let them grow together, gather the tares, and then gather the wheat. Joseph Smith says, no, gather the wheat from amongst the tares first. And what do we find in the Epistula Apostolorum? The same thing. So I thought that was significant. Here's another one. Like I say, the more extraordinary the LDS teaching, the more extraordinary it is that we should find it in an ancient text. Joseph Smith said, the world and earth are not synonymous terms. That in and of itself is significant. We can talk about that another time. He said, the world is the human family. The earth was organized or formed out of other planets, which are broken up and remodeled and made into the one in which we live. That one citation of Joseph Smith alone would answer all of the questions regarding what Hugh Nibley called the pre-Adamites and previous creations and young earth creationism versus old earth. Second Enoch. And the whole constitution of the earth will perish in the flood, and all the earth will quake. It will be deprived of its strength from that day. Then I will preserve the son of your son Lamech, his first son Noah. And from his seed I will raise up another world, and his seed will exist forever, until the second destruction, when once again mankind will have committed sin in front of my face. Second Enoch is using the term world in exactly the way Joseph Smith described it. The world is not referring to the earth, it's referring to a human family. So when the world was destroyed at the time of Noah, and the earth was repopulated by Noah and the 8 souls in the ark, it was described as another world, which I found interesting. Wow, we made it. How about that? And of course, that's maybe about 20 of the 179.
So we'll make this like a 9-part series, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it'd be fun.
Yeah. No, that was good. So you want to like end the share? We can actually just wrap a few things up. But no, that was very informative, and I'm sure that will whet the appetite of those who may be interested in purchasing the book. And in the show notes, I'll have the links on Amazon to the Kindle, hardback, and paperback versions of the volume. So just like 1 or 2 final questions before we wrap things up. Is there any particular topic that you don't think has been like discussed either in your book or other volumes that you hope maybe like more discoveries or more research will add light to? Like, to give you one example from my research, there wasn't really much work done on Sage Joseph's identification of the Ancient of Days from Daniel 7 with Adam and Michael.
Right.
And I've been working on that on and off like over a year now, and hopefully we'll be getting some things published
How exciting.
in my workplace. So, I kind of noticed, with the exception, like, say, a chapter in an unpublished book by the late John Tretnes that I came across, thanks to Jeff Bradshaw for that. There wasn't really anything on that.
John's amazing.
Yeah, no, he was. But so do you think there's any particular doctrine or concept that at the moment there hasn't been that much work done, but you like are hopeful, like maybe with the forthcoming volumes that are coming out or whatever, there might be something in the future, if that makes sense?
Well, that's a huge question.
Okay.
I mean, the Old Testament is just one big question mark, right? I would love to know more about all the ancient patriarchs. Wow. More about Abraham and Egypt, more about, well, what I want to get is the rest of the Pearl of Great Price. But John Gee says that the Pearl of Great Price that's missing is a section on Abrahamic astronomy. I'd love to have that. I'd love to know more about Enoch, Adam, of course. Oh my goodness. Well, and so many things about the life teachings of Jesus Christ. As the book of John says, the world itself could not contain all the books that would be written. Oh my goodness, we're just scratching the surface. The 40-day literature, of which the Pistis Sophia is probably the most significant. Wow, is that? Well, that's too big of a question for me.
No, fair enough.
Get to work and find it all, buddy. Let's go.
No, fine. It's like for years that was always an issue for me. So like once I got assigned a certain project at work, I decided to incorporate that into my research. So
well, what's been fun about this book for me is it has done that very thing. Depending on how much weight you place on the veracity, they've answered so many questions. Like, who are the wise men? People are still, where do they come from? They came from Iran. They came from Persia. What?
Yeah, there's even a thesis among some LDS they were the Nephites.
Right. But Revelation of the Magi, because, well, and the other question I've been asked, of these 66 texts that you cite in your book, which of them do you think are true? Kind of a question.
Yeah, in fact, that kind of goes into, like, say, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, related to that. Like, what's your advice to Latter-day Saints who are studying these kind of extracanonical works? I think like section 91 is a good help. But like, I think we can agree, like, there's a lot of really cool stuff, and there's loads of convergences with Latter-day Saint practice and theology. but there's also some like a lot of weird stuff as well, as in false stuff. Like take 1 Enoch, really important text, especially if we understand the messianic expectations of the man. But there's also a lot of false things as well that we would think, like the interpretation of Genesis 6 and some other topics. So related to like, is it true, blah, blah, blah. What's your advice to like, say, a Latter-day Saint, who wants to pick up, say, Charles Wirth's books on the Pseudepigraphica or the Nag Hammadi text, or even the standalone deuterocanonical books like Sirach and the Psalms of Solomon? What would your advice be to them when you're going through these texts?
My advice is the advice given by Hugh Nibley, who pioneered this amongst Latter-day Saints, this type of work. He said, I compare everything I read to the Book of Mormon, which was part of the genesis of this book. So it removed me from having to make those judgment calls for people. I simply compared these ancient texts to LDS teachings. That in and of itself is the measure of how much importance we can ascribe to these ancient texts. So bottom line, I would not, I need to be careful here. I have no authority to determine what is scripture, what is not in any way. This is simply opinion from what I take seriously in terms of my own reading. But I would not have included anything in Mormon Doctrine in the Apocrypha that I believe was heretical. Do I believe that those 66 texts are all scripture? Possibly, but I do believe they're all inspired. Why do I believe they're all inspired? Because of the undeniable, shocking parallels to the restored gospel. I mean, if you don't see that, how can you not see that? How can that not affect you? But I also give the advice that was given to Joseph Smith in the Doctrine and Covenants when he was studying the biblical Apocrypha, that there are many things that are true and many things that are not, and that you can be benefited by the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit will guide us according to what we already know to be true, which is the revealed scripture, the Book of Mormon, the Bible, and the Doctrine and Covenants. It will serve as our guide. Now, along those lines, I was going to, where did that go? Just show people the texts that are out there, and that, and they're listed in my book, but I wanted to show them just for fun. And they're not as many as you would think. If you wanted to acquire your own extracanonical library, this is how you do it. And you're familiar with all of these.
Yeah.
Old Testament pseudepigrapha 1 and 2. Those are huge.
Yeah, fortunately now they've actually are now available in paperback form and also Logos form.
Right.
When I was like 19 or 20, I purchased the 2 volumes as hardbacks, and they cost €105.
Yeah,
which is about
right.
like $120. So yeah, they're cheap now.
but what you're getting 2,000 pages. I mean, we're talking like almost 50
and as an
ancient
investment,
texts.
yeah, that's the
and they're the most authoritative. I mean, most scholarly produced. And then here's the 3rd volume of Old Testament pseudepigrapha, which was very useful. Then we have the New Testament Apocrypha, Volume 1, Volume 2. Then here are the new ones. That one came out in 2008, I think. This one came out the month after I published my book. And this one's coming out next month. I've already ordered my copy.
Same here.
So exciting, right? This is the edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls that I prefer, the Michael Wise Nag Hammadi Library. By the way, I wanted to say this in reference to, we have all, hundreds of these ancient texts. They are not all equally valuable, doctrinally speaking. The Nag Hammadi Library is the premier example to me of how these ancient texts changed over time. Nag Hammadi Library had 13 codices, I believe. And I believe that the arrangement of the texts in this publication are chronological. So when you start at the beginning of the Nag Hammadi Library, to me, it reads very much like Mormonism. but it was so disheartening to me. As you get about halfway through the library, the Hellenistic elements become prominent and start creeping in. And you witness in this text the Hellenization of Christianity in the first few centuries of the Common Era. It was depressing to me. I love the first half of it. The second half of it, I just want to cry. It's
Yeah,
so
it's like reading the patristics. Like you read the Didache and Justin Martyr. It's like, okay, they're tracking well. They have some issues, but like they're going well. And then you read like say Augustine or someone just before him. It's like, oh geez, dude, seriously. But yeah,
it's so interesting to see how that happens throughout history when it has always happened because people are dumb. Pissa Sophia, the untitled text, the books of Yehu. Back when I first acquired this, it wasn't published. I think I had to get it through interlibrary loan from some library in Texas to get my copy. Um, and what's fascinating to me in the Pissa Sophia, I think it's Jesus who is speaking. If you want to know more about these ordinances, refer to the books of Yehu, which is the script for endowments. Amazing to me. There's the revelation of the Magi. First and second books of Adam and Eve. Fascinating account. One of the things that I like best about this account, it gives us the best description I have seen of what it was to be a terrestrial being, experience a fall from paradise to the telestial world, where Adam describes first person the change of when he was in paradise, the things he could do, hear, and see, and how he felt, and he was a being of light. And then when he fell into mortality, the pain, and such a compelling and a descriptive account of how it felt to become telestialized. It's really interesting to me, and also exciting as we are looking forward to the second coming and the paradisiacal glory of the earth being restored. I mean, to be a part of that and to experience what he experienced in the Garden of Eden, that would be amazing. And then the Apostolic Fathers. So those texts, and they're not very many, but if you could acquire them, and almost all of them are available digitally, and you would have a nearly complete extra-canonical library.
yeah, and just on the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find into a very good English translation. The one I use, it produces in one column the original language, usually Aramaic, and the other column a translation. The Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition by Garcia Martinez and Tigchelaaor. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. The thing though is like it's published by Brill, so you know you have to sell your firstborn to get it. If you can find a cheap copy though, that would be a good one to get as well.
Yeah.
If you know the original languages as well, so it helps.
Well, this is the kind of stuff. Given time and energy, I would go on and on about this type of stuff, learning and sharing the things that are out there. We live in such a glorious time. Putting together my book would not have been possible for one person at all to have done even 10 to 20 years ago. We didn't have the means, the digital means to be able to do that, to be able to have access to all of it now, to compile it and self-publish. It was just fun. It was a marvelous treasure hunt. I had a wonderful time doing it. And there's still so much, even now that it's compiled and organized alphabetically, and I can find stuff and I know where it is. Just like any sacred text, it always has things to teach us with individual teachings, as well as the whole point of a concordance is to find correlating teachings and the significance of that over time, and also what those correlating teachings have to say about each other in terms of informing our understanding of those teachings. Because the restored gospel is still being restored, right? And to quote Joseph Smith, it is impossible for a man to be saved in ignorance. That's actually quoting God out of the Doctrine and Covenants, right? And then, of course, in Second Nephi, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. We don't quote the rest of it, which is, I think, is at least as significant. From them that shall say we have enough, from them shall be taken away even that which they have. That the process of learning immortality, because of our mortal condition, is not stagnant. It's either progressive or regressive. If we're not progressing, if we're not learning, we're actually sliding backward, if that makes sense. So that's a lot of what drives me. Because of the age in which we live, I've developed an addiction to learning something new every day, because we can, with the touch of a button. And especially in terms of the gospel, the restored gospel. Good grief, all the work that you have done. How many works are you attempting to publish right now? I can't even keep up with what you're doing.
I'm working on 2 very lengthy projects for work at the moment, so that's taking most of my time.
Wow.
2 books I hope to get to someday will be documentary history of Joseph Smith's prophecies, and also a book on the relationship between prophecy, free will, and God's relationship to time. So,
yeah, I'm going to buy it. I'll buy it for sure. That sounds fascinating to me. So,
but yeah, no, this has been really informative. So thanks again, Ken, for your time. And as I said, on the show notes, I'll include links to the Kindle, paperback, and hardback editions of your book for those who want to pursue texts. It will save a lot of initial legwork for those who want to study, like, say, non-canonical works and the relationship to Latter-day Saint themes and topics.
well, yeah. Exactly. I mean, for Latter-day Saints who want to dive into this pool of extra canonical texts, it's huge. You could easily get swallowed up. And so this book is the book that I wanted. I would have happily bought it from somebody else. This is the place for a Latter-day Saint to start to find out what's out there. And I've cut through all of the junk, well, in my view, which is not relevant or perhaps even spurious, because copyright was not a thing back then. So that was an issue.
Well,
thank you.
Oh no, my pleasure. And thanks again for your time. And if you ever do like, say, a new edition of the book, especially with the forthcoming works coming out, let me know, and we can do like a part 2 where you can discuss some of the any new updates you come across.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, there's already new stuff coming, so we'll see. We'll see when.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that volume 3.
Thank you.
So, no, my pleasure. And again, thanks for your time. And hopefully this has been informative to those who listen to it. So thank you very much.